Excuse me a minute. On behalf of Busboys and Poets, thank you so much for joining us for tonight's discussion with Dr. Monique Couvson and Fatima Goss-Graves about Dr. Couvson's latest release, Girls Unlimited. We can clap and celebrate. That's what we're here for. Thank you, thank you. If you don't know anything about us, Busboys and Poets is a community where cultural and racial connections are consciously uplifted and a space for art, culture, and politics to intentionally collide. Our Busboys and Poets servers are going to be helping us out throughout the entire program with putting in orders. I also want to remind you that there will be a Q&A after the discussion and a book signing after the program. And Girls Unlimited is here available for purchase. And now a little bit about the book we'll be discussing here tonight. Building on her groundbreaking research that exposed how schools systematically fail Black girls, Dr. Monique Couvson expands her lens in Girls Unlimited, exploring the many ways our society overlooks the unique experiences and needs of all girls. Interweaving heartwarming and heart-wrenching stories from her own life and career with interviews with other high-profile advocates and insightful anecdotes about girls she's connected with around the world, Dr. Couvson offers a wide range of recommendations for everyone from parents to policymakers. And now a little bit about our speakers here with us tonight. Fatima Goss-Graves is a nationally recognized leader in the fight for gender justice and an expert CEO of the National Women's Law Center, president of the National Women's Law Center Action Fund, and a co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. Fatima has distinguished track record working across a broad set of issues central to the lives of women and girls, including income security and COVID relief, equal pay, ending sexual harassment and violence, health and reproductive rights, education access, and workplace justice, with a particular focus on outcomes for women and girls of color. She is widely sought after for her effectiveness in the complex public policy arena at both state and federal levels, and regularly testifies before Congress and federal agencies. Dr. Monique Couvson, President and CEO of G4GC and co-founder of the National Black Women's Justice Institute, is the author of several books, including Push Out, Black Stats, Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, and Charisma's Turn, all from the New Press. Her work has been featured by Time, NPR, The New York Times, MSNBC, Essence, The Atlantic, TED, The Washington Post, Education Week, and others. And now I'm going to pass it off to them. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. It's always so funny when people get to that last line and just kind of going on and on and on and on. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you all for braving the cold and coming out to hear me talk about Girls Unlimited. I'm sure people will trickle in as we start the program, and I'm grateful to all of you who are here early and able to be in full community with us. I'm also especially grateful to you, Fatima, for taking the time to be here with me. When I first was thinking about people I wanted to make sure I was in conversation with this project, you were one of the first people that I thought of because we go way back in this work. And so I wanted to, and most of my books are love letters to people in the field. I really try to name names and tell stories that can illustrate to people who's in the room. So much of our work in advocacy for girls and gender expansive youth has been a work behind the scenes and a work in hostile space. And so I wanted to be, in conversation with the people who are in the conversations. And so I'm really grateful to you for saying yes. Okay, so I want to start tonight by giving you a little bit about Girls Unlimited and why I wanted to write it. I wanted to produce something, like I said, I tell stories that are essentially love letters to people in the field, but it's also a way of documenting my own work and my own life. And I've written a lot of books that are anchored in research and policy, anchored in experience and observation, And I hadn't really written something yet that talks about who I am in this work and how I came to this work. And what informs me in this work? Who teaches me what teaches me in this work? And so Girls Unlimited was an opportunity for me to pause and reflect on my own journey as I come to this world of advocacy, and also a very strong plea for us not to give up in this moment. These are difficult times, but we were musing earlier that it's always a difficult time when you are an advocate for girls. So there's, we won't say there's nothing new, but the, notes from the ancestors and elders teach us, and our own experiences also teach us. And so I wanted to start tonight by reading a little bit from the book, and then we'll be in conversation about the book, which some of you are in. So I start this book by talking about what teaches me most, and that is my daughters, my children. It is a deep responsibility for me to be and I feel a deep privilege to have been able to raise girls while being a national advocate for girls. It's a different kind of experience when you don't walk away from it, ever. And when your children really can help deepen your own personal inquiry and force you into conversations to to protect girls, your girls. And so I start this project by talking a bit about girls and their knowing, and I call it knowing. My younger daughter, Mahogany, has always been precocious. For as long as I can remember, she has been inspired by learning and excited to share her knowledge with others. One of my favorite images of her is a photo taken during her third grade science class in 2012. Just like a between Oakland, where I was based at the time, and Los Angeles, where they were. We spent our time together exploring how we might begin to make academic concepts relatable to the public, and how we might continue to amplify the voices of girls in ongoing public discourses about educational equity. We talked through potential approaches to popularize rhetoric that includes women and girls and narratives about the impact of racial bias. And as I had done over the course of their lives, I brought my daughters to work with me. After a full day of meeting, we broke for dinner. Both girls were excited to finally get outside to the boardwalk, so they quickly assembled by the door as we prepared to leave the hotel. Mahogany walked up to Priscilla and asked a question not uncommon for inquisitive and unfiltered children. "How old are you?" she asked. "How old do you think I am?" Priscilla responded. Mahogany looked at her carefully and then replied, 19. Priscilla laughed and pulled Mahogany in close. "See," she chuckled, "I love you." Mahogany smiled, satisfied by the affirmation, and went on to tell Priscilla more about herself. After a short conversation about the gracious aging process of Black women, how Black don't crack, I looked on as Mahogany continued her conversation with Priscilla. "I've read so many books," she announced, beaming with pride. "That's great," Priscilla said in a soft and even tone. "But what's really important is that you have a critical analysis." "Critical analysis?" Mahogany repeated, her 8-year-old voice softening with uncertainty. "Critical analysis," Priscilla repeated firmly. Mahogany nodded, and she's been nurturing this notion of her expressions of leadership ever since. As her mother, I remain grateful to Priscilla for sharing that nugget of wisdom and truth with my daughter. Both of my daughters have had the opportunity to interface with many powerhouse women throughout their lives, and this is among my favorite moments because in that exchange, Priscilla challenged Mahogany to do more than just read. She wanted her to think. She encouraged her to know. She wanted her to lead with this knowing. And this underscored the importance for me to continue teaching both of my daughters the power of engaging each and every way we might acquire and express knowledge. Activating the critical analysis of girls unlocks their ability to access their multiple ways of knowing. So I share that exchange because it's foundational. And it's the type of thing that often girls are discouraged from engaging in, right? And there's this way that I wanted to intentionally think about how to raise girls who would be free in a society that would otherwise seek to undermine that freedom, right? And I'm really grateful to those of you in the room who've been a part of this journey from the very beginning. Some, like I was saying with Lillian, the office they used to go to when I was in meetings was hers. Nikisha was the one who funded the study that Kimberly and Priscilla and I were meeting to discuss. Like, we've been in this work a really long time and thinking about how we can, apply 15,000 here to answer this one question, or 25,000 there to answer another question. And it's really been a labor of love, but also one that is worth us interrogating why it is that we have had to fight so hard to establish the legitimacy of inquiries that center girls. And so, Fatima, as we start to think about how we come to this work, maybe you can just share just a little bit about the National Women's Law Center so folks have some grounding in that, and then let's dig in.
Yeah, well, are known and seen with a level of confidence, smarts. So many of us who have younger children used to be like, what is your secret? What do you do? How do you do it? And even that snippet says so much. And so anyway, I am so grateful to be here tonight. I lead the National Women's Law Center, and at the Law Center, the work we do, we think of it as gender justice. We do it in the courts, we bring cases, we advocate for policy change at the federal and state level, and we engage in sort of cultural conversations to move people in their hearts and their minds. And I've done this work a long time on a lot of different issues. We were multi-issue and multi-strategy since our founding, which was over 50 years ago. Our co-founders led the National Women's Law Center for the first 45 years, and I led the organization for the last 8. But I was there before in a range of roles, and that is how I met Monique first. I don't even know what year it was. It was sometime in the Obama years when we were doing the work to think about how to use data to open a conversation about the experiences that Black girls were having in school. And I have to say, I don't think we understood that the work at that time, which was now, I don't know, maybe almost 15 years ago, was almost radical to even ask a set of questions and let alone demand solutions. Felt like we were being subversive at the time. But it is the work I think of as my heart work, because at the time I was leading our education program. I've had a bunch of different jobs at the Law Center. And it is work that stays with me for all time. And so as I was reading the book, I was like, you were taking me on a journey of without realizing it. This book is about, there's so much of Monique in this book, and once you all will read it, her personal narratives, the stories you're telling. But you were taking me on a journey of my own career in a bunch of moments without realizing it. So a lot of gratitude to you for that too. That was special.
Thank you. There's a lot of work in the advocacy on behalf of and with girls that happens behind closed doors, as I was saying before. And for me, with Girls Unlimited, it was really a chance for us to tease out some of the things that I have learned over the years to inform my own understanding of what works to create conditions for girls to thrive in this society, but also how we, the intention is for us to collectively pick up some of these elements that are about investing in our girls in a way that hopefully speaks to each one of you. A lot of times when people think about investment, they think only about the money, and they think only about dollars, and if you don't have money, then you don't think it's your responsibility. What I wanted to do was challenge that and lead us into a space where we have a much more robust understanding of what it means to invest, what is required to pour into lives that are unlimited, and to lean a bit into some of the teachings and learnings that I have acquired over time and that young people continue to bring to the fore, right? And I think as we think about, so I structured the book to talk about things that are foundational, like knowing and being in touch with one's own sense of understanding and all the multiple ways that people know. The excerpt I read was an intro into how I come to this conversation around sacred inquiry and what it means to see girls as sacred. For those who've been following my work or thinking about my work know that I say our girls are sacred and loved. And so this is an invitation to unpack that a bit. It started and comes from girls' own articulations of what they would like to see, but I'm also very clear that how we treat that which is sacred is very different than how we treat that which we determine to be disposable. And so I wanted to remove this conditional love that we have for girls, like if she acts right, I will, kind of way that we engage with girls, and lead us more into a space that allows for us to think about what we need to be to be in a space to protect girls, but also to provide the conditions that finally, like what I say in the book, is that finally lead us to a space where girls are thriving, not despite what they've been through, but because of what we do. And that's a big shift. And it requires us to do several things around education and mentoring, around analysis and examinations of structures that may be part of the tapestry of harm in their lives, how we fix those structures so that they become tapestries of healing, and how we build out, a more robust understanding of what it means to protect people from, or younger people from gender-based violence, the kinds of schools they need, the kind of mentorship they need, and finally, yes, what kind of money they need in order to thrive. And so it's really an invitation for us to world build, and you've been a world builder for some time, and your primary tool is the law. And so it's an interesting, I think you might, the only attorney I'm talking to on this tour right now. But we're in a specific moment around the law and girls and their bodies and how we protect them or not. And so, I think it's an important moment for us when we come to think about what kind of society we're building, because, my primary critique is that people make laws, right? People make policies.
They do.
And so the more we begin to inform people's consciousness, the more we will create policies and laws that are responsive to the things we want rather than destructive to their well-being.
Yeah, so it's one of at the Law Center, we like to say that we use the law in all its forms. We think about the law very expansively. It's why we work as litigators, but we also work to build and change laws and to change the culture that enables them. And, when I think about the law as a tool, it is not the only tool, but it is one that is really, really powerful, right? And it is also the case that throughout the world and in our own history in this country, that women and girls in particular have not fared well when the only deciding force are the whims of who's considered the strongest, right? Like if the only thing that decides whether you are safe or not, whether you are healthy or not, whether you get to learn or not, is whether someone with more power says it's okay, that has not been a system around the world or here where women and girls fare well. Right? If you are the strongest person in the room, or you curry the most favor, or you give a favor, if that is the world we are going into. So part of the work we're doing right now at the National Women's Law Center is just protecting the idea that there is a rule of law and that there still is a democracy. And it is one that I will keep fighting for. And I may be the last person who fights for it at the end, but I won't stop. I won't stop fighting for it. But I also think your point and reflection around people is really important, because yes, you have the law, right? And it doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it also matters who the judges are on the courts. And for those of you who have been tracking, the difference in having Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's voice on the Supreme Court in a set of cases is night and day, right? The questions she asks, the things that she names as important, it matters who's in these roles. It also matters who are the people who make up these positions in any given point in time. I think about the acceleration points we've had in our work together. When, for example, Catherine Lehman at the Department of Education, leading the Office for Civil Rights, a mother of Black girls, who entered the conversation in a different way. The tools she put out around school discipline, seeing the specific race and gender together.
Reading my report.
Reading your report. It did not just sit on a shelf. But the report became policy, and that happens that could have happened under different leaders. It took her leadership to make that happen. Or I think about the women in Congress who launched the caucus for Black women and girls, and who did so telling their own stories of girlhood and what they hope to see in the future. Their leadership really mattered. And I contrast that with some of the leadership we are having in this moment, when some of the fights we're having, I see my friend Damon Hewitt has entered. And our organizations are co-counsel in a case against the administration's anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion executive order. The difference, the swing in less than a year from building out pathways that said, how do we ensure that Black women, that women have access to jobs, trades, skills that they historically have been excluded from, where they can make more wages and support their families, to having that be illegal DEI, where we have to actually sue them to ensure that the organization that has been training women to get on the job, like that swing, that is a people difference, right? And so you can't have a conversation around structurally what the law can or can't provide without also having a conversation around people. And then the last thing that I will say that I think is a thing that sometimes people leave out, I love how you talk about the investment in girls very fully. Surely Priscilla was investing in mahogany, and that is the most beautiful way to tell that story. But money matters, right? I mean, many of us have been involved in this big conversation around the bill that Congress passed over the summer. Some of us call it the big ugly bill, but the bill that basically would cut $1 trillion from Medicaid, gave historic tax cuts to billionaires, and there was no like love offering to girls, really to anyone, right? And that was not love offered to the people community. So how you invest with should match how you invest with your heart and your other talents.
Yeah, I definitely believe there should be alignment. And I think that one of the greatest gifts of leading an organization like G4GC is that we get to be in spaces to encourage people to move their resources in alignment with the values of our communities. And it is an interesting thing because we're very good at naming women who do amazing critical things, right? And we very seldom pause to explore how they got there, right? Like people, if they want to tell their own personal stories, may tell the story through an autobiography, which is a very sort of filtered way to explore and examine what the trajectory might be for aspiring young girls, you know. And it's inspirational for people to read how you get these prominent figures, but the everyday girl, or the girl who is systems involved, or the girl who is just trying to survive multiple, you know, sources of harm in her life, she may not aspire to be a judge. She may want to be a teacher who can go to school every day, teach young people how to be well and live a happy life, right? She may be somebody who craves simplicity and not the limelight, right? She may not even want to, you know, hold a public space at all or a private space at all. And what is required for us to invest in her is actually the same thing that is required for us to invest in those that do seek a more prominent position. Because if our goal is to seed, you know, SEED, power in young people, then we have to seed CEDE, power from the adults who are creating policies, practices, and conditions that are harmful to their well-being. I think, you know, what I've tried to do with Girls Unlimited and throughout the work that I'm involved in, because I wear many hats in community, is just to challenge us to think about, like, what do our girls want? What can we do to protect them and guide them and create conditions for them to thrive because of what we do? What informs them, right? How many of us are in conversations with girls regularly? Consider girls in our even those of us who are thinking big, broad, you know, in big, broad ways around policies, you know, There's structural oppression, of course, but there's also internalized oppression. And that's been the thing that I've been after for years, is just thinking about all the ways that we internalize messages about who we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to do, that inform whether or not we see the value in each human body, right? And how we then create policies and practices or facilitate conditions that lean into our understandings that may be misguided and skewed by a host of other things. And so my work here with Girls Unlimited is to tackle the specific internalized oppression that facilitates gender-based violence in all its forms. A lot of times when people think about gender-based violence, they think about it only as domestic violence or physical violence. And they don't think about all the verbal violence, the structural violence, the policy violence, the sort of misunderstandings or intentional distortions of girlhood that are forms of violence. Even the erasure of girls in some critical spaces can be considered a form of violence. And so as we think about all the things that are harmful, I wanted to flip it and say, okay, well then let's think about what we would create if we had all the things at our disposal, right? If we had all the things that we could pour into this young person outside of programming, what would we do? How would we support her ability to think? How would we support her ability to process information? How would we support her ability to have an analysis so she knows if she's being played or if somebody's trying to gaslight her? How can we support her in her own sense of feeling confident in the classroom, where she knows she's smart and she doesn't think at 6 years old that she's not really, really smart? Like, how do we get to a space where we start to prime them for success rather than priming them to deal with a culture of oppression? And so for me, Girls Unlimited is really about that core question, right? And I think that's been at the center of a lot of our work for years, even in the work that we were doing together around programs, where we would talk about dress codes, right? Talk about not just the way that discipline the fighters, but we're reading and distorting images of girlhood based upon the way it flows. And so I know you want to say something. I see you.
Well, I was glad that you raised school dress codes, because that was something we took on with a bunch of folks in DCPS. And we started this project by interviewing girls, thinking of them as the subjects of our work rather than the chief strategists. And that was corrected very quickly because their experience around what they wore to school and how they were treated was theirs to tell, right? They talked about missing class time because people were focused on how short their skirts were or whether or not they had a head wrap on when there was a rule of no head wraps, and measuring how much skin was showing on their arms, and the constant what are you wearing so that they would not be a distraction in school was a total miss, right? And so what the project changed when we stopped thinking of them as the subjects of our work. And instead, they were our co-authors for this report, and they were the ones naming what would make a difference in their lives. And so they got their schools to make changes. They changed the law in DC. They got DC to change its law around how they thought about school dress codes. But my favorite, and this is how I always think about things, my favorite was like they were in negotiations, and we had attorneys alongside them at the table with one of the schools about what should happen next. And folks were hung up on a head wrap. They were hung up on like the amount of time. And so we were like trying to find a compromise. Folks were working on a compromise. And the girls said no. The next day, everyone wore head wraps. Everyone. And they called it the head wrap clapback. And that, I will just tell you, that was not our idea. We were like, we were at the table. We could work it out. They were done. And that's what drove a solution where they were at the table, and it opened up a different way of interacting, of the school leaders to interact with their young people, not just the girls who were making those demands, but all of their young, a host of questions.
I love that example because a lot of times in like philanthropic spaces or even in movement organizing spaces, folks won't see that as political power building, right? And we have a lot of conversations about what does that look like for girls? What does power building look like for girls? It may look like that. It may look like a head wrap clap back. It may look like braiding. It may look like dance. It may look like twerk for liberation like they were doing in Miami, right? So there are all these ways that girls are using their bodies to challenge and their own analysis to challenge the rules and structures that they are receiving and experiencing as oppressive. And it's our job to think about how we are in right relationship with them in that space, right? When you were like, we initially approached it as if they were subjects, right? Rather than co-authors and strategists, because a lot of times we have a hard time seeing girls as ready for leadership now. We think about how we want them to grow into adulthood a specific type of way, rather than recognizing that they have power inherently in their, and wisdom in their bones, right? And that even at their earliest ages are able to have an articulation that sometimes we receive as challenging, but when we nurture that, it produces something radically beautiful.
I'm so glad you named that, because I think for those who fund in the political space, they have trouble imagining that girls are or young people generally are a space where we should focus. Even though young people, it's like they're going to vote next year. It's not that long. How are we training them up? And in your book, you talk about our friend Joanne Smith and the work she does with an organization called Girls for Gender Equity. And over the years, people have, I know, said to Joanne, can't you create that here? And can't you just clone Girls for Gender Equity and maybe clone you to ensure that there are safe spaces that are affirming, where girls have an opportunity to find their political selves. But you don't have to clone Joanne as the actual solution. Where do you think, though, is the gap around investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think often we're looking for these local messiahs. And that's been a problem for movement building for a very long time, is we look for a single leader who can hold it down, and that's what we invest in. And even some people's giving strategies are we invest in the leader, singular, as opposed to really thinking about how you build and increase capacity to pull out the wisdom and collective leadership of people who actually have a vision for a true and just democracy. One of the things that I share in the book is that some girls and groups of girls who are involved in research around leadership don't even interpret leadership the same way as adults do, and the way that we commonly perceive leadership. They don't see leadership as someone with power telling other people what to do. They see leadership as making collective decisions that benefit everybody. Now, some people have not studied it is a vision, right? We have a collective vision, because the intention is not to increase a single person's personality over another. The intention is for the whole community to thrive. That's actually one of the ways they tend to have that type of worldview, where they'll say, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to continue to pay this forward. I'm going to continue to invest here. I'm going to create something that isn't just about me winning, but it's about how we all come up in this moment in a very specific way. And it's not even just happening here in the U.S. This is like a global way that girls process and practice leadership. That is something that we should study more intentionally and begin to practice in our own ways. And some of us are doing it in small ways, but we still have a lot of work to do to grow that kind of investment, to actually and I wouldn't even small communities, and that's where it should happen. It can be transferable, if not scalable, right? And so, I had, an opportunity, and we have a messaging issue in the U.S. And one of the things that I'm hoping people will take from Girls Unlimited is just the notion that this is our collective interest, that girls' well-being is everybody's business, right? And I started that with Push Out, where, I remember 10 years ago, I would go and talk about Black girls. Well, okay, so let's back up. Like 20 years ago, I got like hate mail for writing about Black girls who were incarcerated. Like, how dare I talk about girls when there's men who are incarcerated, right? The real issue. And I was like, all of this is real, right? Because our communities are sharing surveillance, and that's been my argument for a very long time, is they're sharing conditions. And so we need to think about our investments, as important as it is to have movements that center men and boys, it is equally important to have movements that center girls and gender expansive young people. And so without us having a really strong collective understanding of our full community and the way that they're experiencing various forms of oppression or an inability to fully thrive, we have to be concerned about all those ways. And so I was giving my TED Talk, and I was about to do my little talk about girls, and there was a woman from Kenya who gave her talk about girls. And I was immediately, I was standing off on the side just listening to her talk, and I realized we had a lot of things in common, right? She was in Kenya dealing with female genital mutilation and how school was going to be a pathway to liberation for those girls. I was coming to it from a standpoint of girls who had been in carceral systems and how education was going to be a tool to liberate them from conditions of harm. And so I found this sort of common thread between our work. So I immediately went up to her and I said, I have to see what it is that you're doing, because you're describing things that I think we can learn from, right? A lot of times people go abroad and think that we're going to give them something. Every time I travel, I go to learn. And so I went to Kilgoris, Kenya, which is about 6 hours outside of Nairobi. And I rolled up on her school. They welcomed us in. And I talked to elders. I talked to the village chief. I talked to teachers. And I talked to girls. I'm paraphrasing. And that they needed the community to invest in girls' education. And so when I got to the village chief, I was expecting something different from the village chief. And he was sitting behind his, he was in the full regalia and engagement. And I respectfully sat there and, listened. And the only thing he had to say to me that he kept repeating was, I want more Kakenyas. This is Kakenya's Centers for Excellence, by the way. And he was like, I just want more Kakenyas. He was like, Kakenya went out, she got an education, she got her doctorate, and then she came back here and is educating all these girls, and they're all giving back to the community. I want more of that. He's like, I want these to be the mothers in my community. I want these to be the leaders in my community. These educated girls will become the adults who lead. And I was like, how did you do that? Right? So when I talked to her, I was like, you have to tell me how you got everybody on the same page, because this is at the time when we were trying to have some alignment between the efforts that we're working on men and boys and our work to try to make sure that it was inclusive. And we could not get on the same page with talking points. We could not get on the same page with investment strategies. And she talked about it being done through a very specific type of relationship building that, to me, was a way that she demonstrated her own extended ways of knowing. She knew her community deeply. She knew that she had to have conversations with people. She knew she had to bring in the grandmothers as the big dogs. She knew she had to bring in people who could be the keepers of story and the keepers of culture in a way to get people to understand what she ultimately was trying to achieve, which is more girls who have access to quality education in her village. And it was transformative for me, because I realized that while we in the US have a lot of questions, and many of us who are leading girl-serving organizations or do work with girls have one conversation, most of the public is not in that dialogue. Most of the public is not having those same conversations or having these deep interrogations of policies and practices and laws and structures that harm our girls, and then fight against it. Most folks listen to it, are like, oh, that's too bad, and then keep going.
Well, so the one thing I would say is folks are having that conversation without knowing they're having the conversation. Like our culture sends nonstop messages around who's valued and who's not valued. And actually one of the sort of brewing messages that we're tracking at the Law Center is this sort of latest, more subtle message around maybe a soft life awaits, which is, I find appealing, if I'm being honest. There are days where I'm like, how do I get the soft life? But then I see New York Times headlines that say things like, are women ruining the workplace, which is like a not so subtle version of it. And so one of the things that I think we have to look to are what are the cultural messages that not just our Black girls, but everyone who's in a system around them is receiving, right? Whether they know it or not, about their value, around investment, around love or not, and worthiness.
Yeah. I think that's what I meant when I was saying that it's important for us to develop that kind of critical analysis, right? And why I love that moment with Priscilla so much, because all of these these aren't new messages, like these are actually quite old messages, and
Really old.
really, really old fashioned, like really old messages. And it's been the kind of thing where, as a parent, I made intentional decisions around having conversations with my children about what they were listening to and about these messages from a very early age, because even if they didn't fully understand what was happening, I wanted them to start to develop a vocabulary around identifying certain things that might be hard or might be wrong or might be problematic or destructive even. And that was important because, we were living in Oakland, California, and, on Easter Sunday, the pimps have a parade. I'm not kidding. And I was like, I'm raising two girls in Oakland, and the pimp is trying to show my child one way, and I have to actively intervene in order for that not to be a normalized way for them to process what their future holds, or what their present might hold. And so it is an intentional way that we have to engage with young people so that they don't fall into these positions. Like the latest thing now is the chill girl, where the chill girl doesn't really talk about misogyny or sexism. She just kind of giggles if she hears things because she wants to be the chill girl. And she wants to be the girl who doesn't have, who's not always that's wrong, the advocate or whatnot.
Because feminism ruined the workplace.
Right, because there's this whole distortion of what feminism is and a misunderstanding of what it does. And so it's an interesting thing that we're like having this conversation in 2025, because, these are ideas that I thought were like dead and buried, but we didn't do a great job, I think, in our social movements of ensuring that everybody adequately understood what was at stake here. Yeah. And I think, there are many aspects. I think this, I have my own ideas about like what's happening in the world and our energy and how we, sort of go through moments in history where there is a moment of progress and then a moment of regression. Like we can map that throughout history. But what I think is critical and what I think we need to do is have a deeper and better alignment around what we mean by things and how no matter what we call things, we have some common values around our children and around young people that do not render some as disposable and or prioritize the well-being of others over another group of people.
So when I think about the messages, whether it is the chill girl or the trad wife or what is the soft life, it's hard to disconnect those overt messages from the fact that there are some who are aiming for an authoritarian regime, right? And part of what you have to get there is a mostly uninformed and disconnected set of folks who are used to being controlled, who see that as a good trade-off to well-being. And so I do have some hope that even though you ebb and flow in history and regression, that we will not regress so far that it is hard to undo. And that in the new build, the rebuild, there are opportunities to imagine in the sort of way that you are naming.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I don't offer that to offer this nihilistic perspective. I actually am really encouraged by the things that I see girls building and the way that I see young people across the gender spectrum organizing around these ideas that are also, sort of shared a bit in this book, because I think young people, this next generation, everybody has their things to say about Gen Z, but Gen Z is actively thinking about gender in ways that their elders did not, have not. And so it is a challenge for a lot of folks to process what that means and then to design and build around that. But they have very distinct ideas that I think are worth us exploring and examining, because it's going to challenge us to think about what kind of communities are being built and what kind of communities are possible. I think when we look at the moment we're in and when we look at the movements around the country that are focused on girls and gender expansive youth, I think what we're seeing is that not only are they interrogating gender, but they're also really thinking about how young people can position themselves to express power in dynamic ways, and in many ways more dynamic ways than we thought possible.
Yeah.
And when this when we were met with this moment initially in January, and there was a sort of onslaught, flurry of executive orders and efforts to undermine girl-serving organizations and services and programs that dealt with gender-based violence and education and all the things that we know to be essential to our young people's well-being. Immediately, I kept thinking, we have to take notes from the ancestors, right? We have to think, if they're gonna take away other language, thankfully, we have a very extensive vocabulary and we can describe things in other ways, right? We can use other words. And some of the words that we were using were not great words anyway. And so how do we get creative and how do we get clever in this moment to make sure that we always, always understand that it is never illegal for us to love our young people. It is never illegal for us to love ourselves. And so no matter what laws, policies, practices exist, I will continue to love our people. I will continue to love our children. I will continue to love our girls. And what I want is for us to build community around that love so that it's operationalized, not just stated.
Are we going to be able to take questions?
Yeah, let's do it. Are there any questions or reflections?
And I'll pass around the mic. You can just raise your hand and we'll get started. Okay, I'm going to start over here.
Thank you, ladies, for a thought-provoking conversation. And I actually had a thought that I wanted to throw back at you, because I think there are two things that occurred that bubbled up for me during the conversation. And one that I think is very important, to be very clear, the structures that are holding young people, I won't just say girls, back, are deliberate, they're intentional, and they are fighting like, insert expletive right now, to maintain those structures. Because they have looked into the future and they see a majority minority population. They see more girls going to college than young men. They see more girls getting master's degrees and PhDs. They see young women who are confident and who are focused and goal oriented, and that is scaring the insert expletive of them. So therefore, what I see is, it won't be a last ditch because there's never a last ditch. But I see in the arc of not just this country, because it's happening globally. Girls all over the world are learning. Their mothers are teaching them in Kabul, in small villages, in places that don't make the news. They are learning and they are charting a path for themselves, or they are envisioning a path for themselves. So rather than, this is the second point, in terms of protecting girls, I don't use that language. I think we are nurturing. We need to nurture them. We need to understand that the vision they have for themselves is probably greater than what we can see, just as our great-grandmothers, the lives we lead in this room today, they probably could not have envisioned that for us. But what they did was gave us the gift of the nurturing, of the spiritual nurturing, the familial nurturing, the whispers when they would say, come in my room, baby, and sit on the edge of my bed, and they would tell you a story, or they would tell you that you could do it, or they would tell you they were proud of you. And that kind of nurturing and feeding and helping the seeds grow helped us to get to where we are today. And I think, when I think of what's going to make the difference for my daughter and children beyond her, it's not going to be necessarily a policy, an external policy that changes the world for them. Because policies come and go. And we've seen some policies that were wonderful for one generation and helped them get to college, help their children get to college, help their children get access to homes and things like that. And we kind of see some of the efforts to bring those policies down. But what they can't do is, what your mother told you, you get your education, no one can take that away from you. So I think if we nurture young people, if we invest in their belief system, and we let them fly, we don't try to hold them back, we don't try to hold them to our ideas about what their future should be, but we say, you've got everything you need, and I'm here if you need some more, and watch how they, chart the path. That's what I see as the future, because I feel like we haven't had, our time is not over, but, our time is not the future. They are the future, and we have kind of brought where we can go, and we're here now as fuel to let them go. That's what occurs.
Two things come up for me in that. Thank you. One is, I think you are absolutely right that nurturing is a critical part of how we build out spaces for girls to thrive, young people to thrive. All young people need nurturing. And I kept thinking about the fact that some young people are allowed to receive that nurturing and some young people are not. And that we know adultification bias, for example, is a real experience for Black girls, for example, where they're not actually, like the bias is that there is a belief that they are in need of less nurturing and protection than white girls or their counterparts, right? And so part of when I use the framework around protection, I'm talking about a protection of the conditions that allow for that nurturing to take place, right? So that we're not in conversations about recovery as much as we're having conversations about what we're pouring in. And now we spend a lot of time in the recovery zone because there's a lot of harm. And so because there's so much harm and so much to undo, we tend to have conversations about surviving. We talk about survivors. And I spend a lot of time in this book talking about my own survival from multiple things. And it's because, and I share those things, even though I'm a very private person, I share those things because I'm asking us to build out the world where we can do exactly that, where we can have elders, adults who are pouring into young people, and it doesn't matter, and you give them all the things. You don't reserve some of your things for this one because you think this one is gonna do more with what you have to give than that one. You can have discernment, of course, around what you're sharing with young people, but the goal is for us to see all of our young people as worthy of investment and to be in spaces where there's not a sort of hierarchy around who gets the investment that is based on gender.
Next question. Okay, I see you right there.
First of all, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom with all of us. I've personally been a huge fan of yours for many years. I'm in girls' education and started that my professional journey in New York City, and now I'm back in my hometown in DC as a director of DEI. Don't tell anyone. For now.
She whispers it.
As a director of DEI at a girls' school in the area. And, we're talking about loving on our children, on our young people, on our future leaders. And times are really hard. Times are just really hard. And you've been doing this work for a very, very long time. And so I'm just curious, what is your recommendation on how educators or mentors to girls, like how can we nurture, incubate, and journey with them, especially girls who are on the margins, as we ourselves navigate what you called a very hostile environment, oppressive systems, very inequitable policies, and also like as we ourselves, as the elders, the mentors, are absorbing that in real time and absorbing that harm. So if you have any sustainability best practices to share, because these moments are, it's getting harder to absorb and harder to quickly turn key to our young people who, as you said in your book, are yokes that need nurturing. But it's harder to do in these times.
Yeah, so I approach this, I said earlier to take notes from the ancestors, and so I actually really do mean that. My grandma is from Texas, and when my mom asked her, she's now deceased and has transitioned, but when my mom asked her how she got through the Great Depression, my grandma said, "What depression? We ate every day." And what I take from that is she had a farm, and she knew other people who had farms, and they grew the food internally, and they operated outside of the gaze of white supremacy. They didn't discuss it everywhere, and they fed each other. They shared. I think that's how we're going to get through this moment, is we share. We build partnerships. We build a broader community. We think about what we need and we fill it amongst ourselves. And, for some, that they're like, oh, we can't do that because we don't have enough. But I refuse to engage in that mindset because we do actually have a lot in our communities. We have a lot of resources in our communities. There are girl servings, there are like predominantly girls' schools or all girls' schools around the country. And, folks need to be in conversation with each other about what strategies and, ways that they can build out even a virtual space using the technology we have today to continue to pour into each other. One of the greatest assets that I say we have in all of this work is our time. And everybody's got that, right? Even if you don't have, the financial wealth, everybody's got time. And there's a lot of learning that has happened over the past several decades that we have been able to robustly and openly pour into the work of building institutions that are responsive to the specific needs of girls, that if we create the space where, if I have onions and you have tomatoes, that we're able to make a salsa, right? That we're able to make a sauce together that allows for us to be well in this moment. I do think that we don't do enough of that. I think there's not enough coalition building. We talk in coalition, but we don't practice an alignment around that in the way that we could. If we have a team of, some of us are better at building together teams of therapists to engage, our girls and to be responsive to their specific needs. If we know of an existing consortium, then pull in the other consortium. Like, we have to start to think now about how our communities extend beyond our geographical areas, because that's how we're going to survive this moment.
And we have time for 2 to 3 more. I'm going to start over here. I saw them first, and then I'm going to come back over there to you.
Thank you all so much for this great conversation. 2 of my favorite ginger justice warriors. So my question for you all is, I know that there's a lot of external systems that are causing harm to our Black girls. I would love to hear your thoughts on what do you think is the accountability conversation internally within the Black community in terms of how we, in my opinion, are also causing harm to our young girls, Black girls, specifically on a generational level. And I say that to say, I think it's a conversation, it's a hard conversation, it's a necessary conversation, it's a long overdue conversation. And I think when we look externally, rightfully so, but I also think that we need to have a come to Jesus conversation within our own community on how we are harming, how we are adultifying our Black girls, particularly as it relates to their bodies, as it relates to not honoring their pronouns. I mean, the list goes on and on. So we'll love your thoughts on that.
Why don't you start?
I'll start. So I think, a lot of things happen in the lives of Black girls specifically, right? Many of them experience early onset puberty and begin to experience what I was referring to earlier as adultification bias when they're very, very young. Sometimes as young as 5, but usually the onset of puberty happens around 9, which means a lot of the ways that we interact with them and talk to them within Black spaces shift. But I do also think that when I was talking about the forms of oppression, and I said internalized oppression is the one that I'm working on, that I continue to work on, that's part of it, is what we understand about it, what we understand about our own communities, what we understand about the promise of our communities. I do believe that we need to fix a lot of the vocabulary that is commonplace in our communities, right? We call girls fast all the time. We engage in readings of girls' bodies in ways that subject them to ongoing ideas about their body being the location of their identity and or power. They learn from, creators within our community that is their primary asset, and that it's something that can be negotiated and or bartered. Or bought. And so it is, there's a lot for us to undo. I think continuing to have conversations about that. I go to the source. So I think, I think it's important to have conversations with girls early on. In Push Out, I talked a lot about that because there's a priming, even from the nursery rhymes, for Black girls specifically about their bodies and about the way that they will experience harm. And this priming happens, in ways that we don't even think about. I remember being very young, singing songs on the playground that were not appropriate for me to be singing on the playground. And also that were priming me to get ready for a life of harm, right? Sisters on the corner selling, you know, and so it was like, all right, I'm clear that as the sister in this scenario, I could be on the corner, right? Or I'm very clear that there's this expectation that somehow I will be harmed. And unfortunately, disproportionately, our girls are harmed by people in their families, in our communities. And we don't have the conversations we need to have with all the members of our communities about the harms and the dangers that exist for girls. We say be quiet, and we kind of exercise the Vegas, you know, what happens here stays here, what happens in the family stays in the family, don't discuss my business kind of conversations, rather than deeply exploring how particularly sexual violence plays out, or other forms of intimate partner violence and other, you know, harms enter the lives of girls and shape their understanding of what they should expect in life. And so I do believe that having ongoing conversations is critical. I wish that our, you know, civic, we were talking earlier about our D9 organizations, civic organizations should have more conversations about that, but not just them, right? Not just these organizations. There should be routine ways that we invite our families into discourses about the well-being of our girls, which is one of the reasons I have a chapter on protect their body. Even if you are not a survivor of sexual violence or physical violence, then you are still in a space where the likelihood of having someone in your family is high who is experiencing that. And so who are you gonna be in that family, right? Are you the trusted cousin? Are you the trusted uncle or aunt? You know, are you the person who can come in and be part of a space of safety for not just conversations and education, but also recovery, right? And so these are the kinds of decisions we have to make, but in order to do that, we have to do our own work. And many of us just walk through life wounded and don't actually do the work to recover. And so if you are wounded trying to help somebody else, then what you do is you continue the pain. And that's what you tend to see when folks engage in harsh responses to young people, because they're trying to protect them, but they haven't done their own work or developed their own analysis to understand that what they're doing is actually harmful, not helpful or healing. And so the invitation is, number one, for all of us to do our own work to unpack and heal, and then try to intentionally be part of the tapestry of healing. Be a safety net.
The only thing I would add is that last part around who are you and how are you showing up in this time. I actually think it connects to your question about how tough this time is. And in times that feel like scarcity is the predominant feeling, where people feel like maybe I don't have enough, I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling like vulnerable with my own security, that's when we see a rise, right? A rise in assault, a rise in young Black girls leaving school to care for the other children in their lives, a rise in being disconnected from school and opportunity. And I'm going to be honest, we're in a period of time where there is a very deliberate effort to dismantle a range of nets that have been put in place over decades to hold families, to hold communities, to ensure schools were accountable and figuring out what happens to young people. We have to fill the gap. Question that I think, or that I hope folks will leave here tonight, is what role you will play in that, in filling in the gap in this time.
Okay, I'm going to get this person back here, and then we're going to come and end with this person.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So I just had a quick question. Sorry if this comes out a bit long-winded, but I recently read a book by Anna Giffley called The Double Tax, which discusses the intersections of being a Black woman in America and how that taxes the body. And a common theme in that book. She was quite what can we do when we're mentoring our younger girls to understand that their needs may be a little different? And I've done girls support groups before, so you think of all girls schools or girls who code, and you have girls of all races who are there, but sometimes Black girls need that additional support, but they don't really understand what that support is until later in life. So what can we do when we're mentoring these girls to make sure they can better understand how their needs are different? So when they come back to advocate for themselves, they know exactly what they're advocating for.
Yeah, I asked that question of Mahogany, actually, and I write a little bit about it in the book because she was working, Mahogany is my daughter, I don't know if you hear her, okay. And one of the things that she offered from having mentored girls and done some direct work with young people in the last 2 years is for us to have grace because they may not have the articulation that we want them to have at such an early age, right? And so even if we identify and see something happening, if they haven't developed the articulation yet or understanding or even recognition of what is happening in their lives, to have grace but also stand in the gap, right? I think there are tools that you can begin teaching girls from a very early age to start to develop that muscle. And, you know, part of that is journaling. You know, part of what I would do with my girls, even when they couldn't write yet, was let them keep picture journals. And they would process what happened in their day through their images. And we would talk about it. Talk to girls, right? Continue to help them engage in an ongoing, not just reporting of what happened, but encourage them to think about what happened, ask them questions about how they felt about certain things. You know, make it clear that their opinion and interpretation is important to your understanding of what is happening, right? How are you feeling today? Oh, fine. What made you feel fine? Who got on your nerves today, right? Like all these things to help them tease out what it is that they're actually feeling, so there's not this tendency to just suppress because they think that's fine. The other thing I think is important for us to recognize is that language has many sort of shapes, right? There's the language we speak, but there's also the language we walk, there's the language we sit, there's all kinds of ways of expression that is important for us to read and to develop our own competencies as adults, especially if we're working with girls, to begin to explore, because sometimes a girl's silence is intentional, and sometimes her silence is also her voice. And so it's important for us not to sort of project our own understanding of what we think she should be doing. And that's especially true for girls who are associated with a community that is always advocating for everybody else's well-being, right? And so we have a cultural expectation often among African Americans that you got to speak up and you got to be loud about it. And Black women hold the line, Black women save democracy, Black women do all these things. And it's important for us to recognize that sometimes it's the quiet girl who does her thing, and that's her mode of expression, and she will grow into whatever is right for her. I said I was in Atlanta last night, and I was like, I'm not a marcher. I do not like to march. And I realized that about myself in college, right? I was like, okay, this part is not for me. But I was like, but the things that I could do were to write, right? I was part of the founding staff for the Institute for Research in African American Studies. I like to read, right? So I was like, if I can apply my skill sets, if I can understand how my skill sets can be valuable to the movement, then that's where I enter, right? So, I think with young people, help them uncover how they're feeling, how they're thinking, how they're growing in an issue, help them locate themselves in issues, right? So if we're talking about climate justice, or where people are talking about the environment, help them locate themselves in it. Where do you find yourself in this big, big issue, right? And then become part of the space for her to be able to process how she's feeling about it, such that she can grow into her own articulation and decisions around how she wants to contribute.
So I just want to add one more thing to that, because as you were talking, I was thinking, well, man, I'm almost 50 and I don't know if I know what I need all the time. And what a gift to have the sorts of strategies and ideas to help young people develop that at a very young age. And I just have to name, the book is dedicated to a friend to many of us in this room, Allison Brown, and who died far too young. And one of our last times together, we were out together to dinner when she was very ill, and she started prodding me and another friend of ours to name what is it that we wanted in our lives. And that was like a hard and big, hairy question. And we didn't have good answers. And I left being like, how did I not have an answer to that? And so I started a practice of writing things down, of if I saw something in the world or had a feeling, making a note so that I didn't forget. And so I some of this, I think, is sort of the level of gender expectation, and around Black women in particular, putting yourself second or last and holding up so much. But in this period of time, what does that look like to cultivate that spirit in ourselves going forward? So I appreciate your question.
And it'll shift. Like, I'm over 50 and have these questions, right? So like, also have, again, grace.
Okay, and this will be our last question right here.
Thank you. Well, I'm just so excited to be here. Monique, Dr. Morris, who I knew at the tender age of 26. Wow. And yeah, I'm mid-40s now. That's different. The question I have for both of you, and the seat that I sit in right now, Monique, I will never forget. I do remember your babies, but I also remember one thing you said to me, and what very much felt like the moment that we're in right now is a builder's moment, holding the tension of that, while also not giving the movement or the thing your entire self, so that you can make it to the other side of the moment. And I have carried that through my career. So the question I have for the both of you, and what I feel is very much, a builder's moment. You guys are both bridgers and developers of this incredible movement. As an institutionalist who've decided to stay in the movement for 23 years, what do you need right now from other bridgers and power brokers so that this movement gets to the other side? Just one thing that, like, if you can name it.
Courage. That is the thing. I need people to have the courage to do things that feel hard in a time that can feel really scary. And I believe very strongly that courage is found mostly in community. It's like very, very difficult to find it when there's one brave soul. But when you have a room leaning together in the same direction, it's a very different thing in terms of how you feel. So the thing that I have most wanted to cultivate is that sense of courage, because I also think bound up in it is some optimism. Bound up in it is some belief in you having a level of power.
I'm going to say boundaries. I think there are a lot of different boundaries, personal boundaries to protect. I did tell you that not to bring your whole, I was like, you can bring your whole self to an inquiry, and I firmly believe in that. But I don't believe in giving everything you have to an institution. You gotta hold some things for yourself. You gotta hold some things, and I was taught that, and it has saved my life in a lot of different ways, because so many people sacrifice themselves to the institution or sacrifice themselves and their families to the movement, and then, you know, what are we gonna do with you, right? Where do you go? How are you okay? And so that's what I mean about boundaries, is also making sure that you're clear about what you need in any given moment, right? If you need rest, take some rest. It will be here tomorrow, right? If you need water, pause. If you need to eat, pause. I'm a Taurus, so if I need to eat, I'm gonna eat, right? But there are ways you just have to be clear about what it is that you need. And our institutions right now are being asked to do a lot. I think the movement builders are being asked to do a lot. And I want us to be well. I want us to come out on the other side of this, not sick in all the ways that we see people get sick in moments that follow a crisis. Stress kills. Get some therapy. Talk it out. Work out. Do whatever it is that you need to do. Do some yoga, breathe, like all the things, all the practices, or whatever works for you. Pray, you know, do what you need to do, but take care of the things that are important to you so that you can be well enough to be in this space, and so that you can just be well on the other side of it. The reason I kept bringing up the historical ebbs and flows is because that's another note from the ancestors, right? Like, they had boundaries. When it was time to have joy, they were like, let's have this little house party right quick, right? Like, or they were like, if I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat this food that makes me feel good and be in community with my family in a way that allows me to cherish my humanity. That this moment that we're in is meant to make us lean into the robotic, incessant way that we respond to harm. And we have to establish the boundaries to say, no, like these communities are important to me, these people are important to me, and I'm gonna be well so that I can be here on the other side.
We can give it up one more time for our speakers. Thank you. I also wanted to thank you all again for joining us, and thank you both for this wonderful conversation. I want to remind you one more time that Girls Unlimited is here available for purchase. We know you can get this book anywhere, but we would really appreciate if you got it here with us tonight. It's also a special opportunity as Dr. Monique will be signing copies. So make sure you get one tonight if you are going to get one. Also want to remind you to close out your tab before you leave today and tip your server if you think we did a good job. And with that, have a great rest of your night. Thank you.